Hello and welcome back to the MSC YouTube studio. I'm Jack Kelly from TLDR News, and this time I'm happy to be joined by Dr. Hannah Neumann, a Green member of the European Parliament, as well as the European Parliamentary Chair of the Delegation for Relations with the Arab Peninsula.
Very happy to be with you.
Fantastic. I'd like to start with the Arab Peninsula, an area that you're obviously very familiar with. And before the outbreak of the war in Gaza, there was a lot of optimism in the region. We were seeing warming ties between Saudi Arabia and Iran, ongoing peace negotiations between Saudi Arabia and the Houthis, and talk of normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel. Following the war, though, do you think that some of these regional attempts at stability have been scuppered? And if so, do you think things can be turned around?
Well, indeed, many of us were quite hopeful to see that the region that for decades has been a place of many wars, of a lot of suffering, where many people had to flee from their homes, would finally come to some kind of peace, or at least less violence. The events of October 7, some see them as in relation with that, because clearly for Hamas, for example, it wouldn't have been a good thing that Saudi Arabia and Israel, for example, have continued with their rapprochement, which might have been one of the reasons of the most recent escalation. At the moment, indeed, it has become much more difficult. And we see Iran and its proxies steering violence at multiple places with the Houthis in the Red Sea. We look at the role of Hezbollah. We look at the role of militias in Iraq that are close to the Iran. And everyone is quite worried whether it will blow up even further, and putting a lot of attention into trying still to keep it somehow handleable. The future will show us where this will take, but for sure, and that has changed, beyond the layer, I would say, of ministers of foreign affairs, there is a lot of communication channels that have been built in recent years and that we can now rely to.
It's good to hear. Moving on to the topic of energy security, obviously following the issues in the war in Ukraine, we saw a lot of European countries scrambling to replace Russian oil and gas, and generally looking towards places like Qatar and Azerbaijan. But with this, are you worried that European countries are simply switching suppliers from one authoritarian state to another?
It's a bit different. What we have done in the past, and the previous German government has been at the forefront of this massive mistake, is to be fully dependent on one problematic supplier of energy, which was Russia.
Yeah.
On the other hand, we have the problem that if we wanted to buy oil and gas only from, let's say, nice countries, we just wouldn't have enough.
Yeah.
Because Norwegian gas there. And then it already starts being complicated, right?
Sure.
So we need to buy it from somewhere else. And the strategy at the moment is just to diversify. So rather than buying, let's say, 60 or 70% from one problematic country that can use that to blackmail us, and we are trying to have as many sources as possible so that one can fill in for the other and it doesn't limit us in our political decisions. So yes, it's coming from Qatar, we're talking with Saudi, we're talking with Oman, we are also talking, especially when it comes to renewables, with the Northern African countries. And the idea is to diversify so that we have as many suppliers as possible, so that when it becomes problematic with one, we can stop it from there, so they can't blackmail us, and we can just substitute it with another.
When it comes to decision-making like this and EU foreign policy in general, it often feels like it's a little bit confused, with institutions, key figures, and even national leaders sometimes contradicting and undermining each other. Do you think that this is an issue? Do you think this current system is working within Europe? Or do you think there's a need for a shake-up and restructuring?
It's complicated.
Yeah.
It's an issue, I can tell you. And I think it needs reshaping. Because what we have seen in the past is the policy areas where the European Union as a whole has the competency. So where it's the European Union that decides with different decision-making mechanisms, we are very strong. And we can shape the world. And the places where we are not, the policy areas where we are not, where we fall apart, where we contradict each other, where it becomes slow, we are not. And we simply can't afford that anymore. To give you one example, the last time Trump was president, he tried to start a trade war on Europe. That was his idea, hoping that he could play Germany against France and the Brits and whatever, just to find out that trade actually is a competency of the European Union, so that if he pokes us, we all stand the 500 million and we tell him, okay, but it's going to have consequences.
Yeah.
And the moment he found that out, we never heard about this idea of a trade war with Europe anymore.
Yeah.
And that clearly shows if we stand united, we are strong, we can shape things. And that's where we need to get in all foreign policy areas. But it's not easy, because you would need all 27 member states to actually agree to give power away, which is not what many politicians like to do, and to give it to the European level. But I think reality will force us, and we rather do it sooner than later.
Sure. And we've also seen recently a wave of farmers' protests across Europe, with national and even European governments scrambling to try and address these issues and concerns that are being raised in the protests. As a Green politician, are you concerned about the concessions that are being made by the European Commission and other governments? And what do you think we can do to ensure that we do progress with the green transition while making sure that certain communities aren't left behind?
At the moment, I'm very concerned that we need to make sure that the green transition stays on track. And it has been easy in the past, where everyone was just putting up ambitious goals, like net zero by, minus 50% by. But that was kind of the easy part of it. We're going to make fancy goals that are far away. But now we need to do sector by sector. So mobility, housing, agriculture. We need to go sector by sector and see how we can reduce emissions, because in the past it didn't play a role, so there was just a lot and a lot of emissions. And now we really need to rethink every area, and this is difficult. And it asks us to rethink. It asks us to change the way we did things. And I can understand that farmers, for example, if you tell them you have to do it all differently, and it may even be more costly, that they say, okay, maybe we don't want that. And we have the same thing in Germany when it comes to cars with the combustion engine, where all the companies, many companies say it's difficult, but there is just no other option. So I think we should not go back in terms of the goals, and go back in terms of the ambitions and the standards that we need and the policies that we need, but we need to explain better. We need to give people more time. We need to rethink subsidies. And especially in the German, but also the European debate, we need to rethink money. Because at the moment, everyone thinks we can get this whole transition basically for free. So we don't need additional money. Not raising more taxes to get there, but also not increasing our debt to get there. And that's just not going to happen. We are at this crucial point of time where we need to dramatically change how we do things in terms of the economy to get on towards net zero at a certain point. And at the same time, we are challenged from the outside with the war of aggression of Putin in Russia, in Ukraine, by Russia in Ukraine, which also challenges us. And there's just no way we can manage to live up to these challenges for free. So we need to rediscuss this whole idea of debts, and that we need this money to invest, so that, yes, also for the farmers, there's a way that they can change the way they do agriculture in a good way. For households, that there is a way that they can change where they get their energy from, that they can do what they need to do in terms of isolation without putting them in very difficult situation.
Absolutely. And obviously, when we're talking about European-wide decision-making, we've got very important times ahead. The European parliamentary elections are approaching at the moment, and polling suggests that we're going to see a rightward shift in the way that people are going to be voting. If that is the case, what do you think this means for Europe's approach when it comes to things like human rights, democracy, peace, foreign relations, and so on? And are you concerned about the potential of the new direction?
Well, at the moment, I think let's still fight to make sure that we don't see this right-wing shift, because it would be a very difficult thing for security. But also for the economy. And before I go to the human rights issue, let me touch on the economy. Because what we hear from the big companies is we need reliability. So we are actually ready to move on the path of a green transition. Even like steel industry, they would say, we make these investments, we can do that in a greener way, but we need you to set standards, to give us some subsidies, and then to stick to it, and not to go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And this is the danger at the moment. So with the Green Deal, we embarked on setting these standards that will become global ones. We embarked on giving them clear guidelines where they are heading so that they can make investments, and investments are made for 10, 15, 20 years. And now, if people backtrack on the Green Deal, it's confusing for the economy. It actually puts them in a worse situation than our competitors in Russia, in the US, in China, in all these other places. So we need the reliability to continue the Green Deal, which is what these elections are important for. And if we have a right-wing turn, it's going to be very difficult for our economies to compete. And of course, also on the issues of human rights, also domestically. I mean, there are many people in the migrant community who are afraid where their place would be if this right-wing rhetoric that we hear in Germany, for example, of remigration, which means people that don't look like us need to leave, where this would lead. This is an issue of insecurity to many here that do not look as white as you and me, but also around the world. I mean, I work a lot in Afghanistan. I work with Iranian women. I work in Iraq. People there say, we look up to you. You're the only ones who still care, with the US being very unstable in terms of its foreign policy. And if the EU also has a right turn, they are losing a huge ally, and it will make it very difficult for everyone who wants to fight for democracy and freedom around the world to continue this work, which is why I really think when it comes down to the ballot box and to making this decision, and when people increasingly understand the gravity of this decision, we will not have the right turn. Because we now see these mass demonstrations around Germany, also in the East, where people say, okay, we may not agree on how we restructure our heating. We may not agree on being CDU, SPD, FDP or Greens, but what we agree on is that democracy is where we want to live in, and we need to protect that together. And I think there is a growing understanding that this is actually at stake. And it's unbelievable that we need to say that.
And you mentioned the domestic impact. So if you don't mind, I'd like to zoom in a little bit on Germany. The Traffic Light Coalition has been in power for just over 2 years now. And given the decline in the polls for the governing parties and the rise in right and far-right parties, what do you think as a member the German Greens can learn from their time in government so far? And what do you think your party will take from this?
Well, first of all, the threesome is always complicated.
Sure. Yeah.
I think that's what we can agree on after 2 years. But we need to figure out ways and means. It's the first time in Germany on the national level that it's not two who are a coalition, but it's three. So sometimes we have these 2 against 1 settings, and we just don't have established practices how to deal with that. That would be, I guess, the biggest takeaway. And the second biggest one is we take so much energy in the threesome to talk to each other, to find agreements, that sometimes we don't have enough energy left to communicate to the people actually why this is a good thing, or why we have taken that, or take the time before we announce decisions to explain and to prepare. So, I mean, that is maybe one of the problems that was there with the decision on the farmers in Germany, that they have negotiated over weeks how to fill that gap in the budget, and who needs to do what. And then it was in the middle of the night, so they were fighting until 2 or 3 in the morning. And then they had some conclusion on what could work on the paper. And then as a farmer, if you wake up in the morning, basically, and you listen to the news, and the news is, basically, how you did your work so far, it all changed, and you now need to find different ways, for example, for your engines and for the gasoline, or it's just going to be more expensive, rather than someone telling you, we need to make an adaptation, you have to be part of it. We would suggest it's like that. How do you see it? You know, that's how normally democracy works. And there, I think we need to recalibrate a bit about where do we spend how much energy on communication.
Interesting. Yeah, I can definitely see that. Finally, alongside all of your other responsibilities we've spoken about, you're also the Greens EFA spokesperson for peace and human rights in the European Parliament. And on that note, I think the outlook is pretty bleak on both fronts, it seems, at the moment when it comes to human rights and peace. So I was wondering if you have any cause for optimism on those fronts. Is there any examples of things where you think we're making real progress?
Well, what I tend to say, and I'm reminding myself more often these days, is that the world is a messy place. It has always been. And when we feel overwhelmed by all these conflicts and problems and repression, it's just like make one step in front of the other, find the places where you can change things, and just make sure you always walk in the right direction.
Yeah.
So one example is we are trying at the moment, or we are organizing ways and means to see how we can at least ensure digital education for girls in Afghanistan. Or we are trying to see how we can build alliances between the different women that stand up against repression in Iran. We are trying to find ways for those that have been shot into their eyes because they went to protest, how they can get medical care. So, of course, I'm trying to work on these big political issues, but sometimes they take a lot of time. It goes back and forth and back and forth. But at the meantime, I have these projects where I'm doing very concrete things on the ground, where you are at least having life-changing things for a few people. And there was one project, and we did it for the second time in October last year. It's a music festival in Mosul. Mosul is the city where ISIS back then had its headquarters.
Yeah.
Music was forbidden. They killed people if they only had musical instruments in their houses.
Wow.
And then the Americans, in the end, they bombed down the old city to finally defeat ISIS. And now they're rebuilding the old city. But we were bringing back with this music festival, music in every corner. And we had Christian, Yazidi, Muslim women, men playing together music. And these are the stories also that give hope. And I know a lot of media attention is on the big wars. But there are a number of places and stories that can give hope, and maybe we need to allow them to be more present also in our minds again, so that we don't get the idea that there's nothing we could do, because we can do a lot.
It's very encouraging. Thank you, Dr. Hannah Neumann. Fantastic speaking with you, and thank you so much for your time.
It was my pleasure. Thank you too.